Hello and welcome to one of the most anticipated reviews I've had for a while, the Wooting One keyboard. This is one spectacularly complex keyboard with so many facets and options, so let's get started quickly because there's a lot to go through. I ran into this project at a meetup at Cooler Master where I was immediately intrigued by this, but unfortunately it took me a while to get this one because the contact I had at Wooting silently left the company, so I lost communication with them for a long time, but now it's all finally arranged and they're happy for me to review this one for them. A little bit of introduction. Wooting are a small Dutch company who ran a Kickstarter in 2016 for the production of an analog optical keyboard, and they succeeded rather well, raising €135,000 on a €30,000 budget. I've been relentlessly pestering their CEO with questions over the last few weeks, and now I can finally show it to you. The idea here is to produce a keyboard that's capable of knowing exactly how far you press down a key, compared to all other keyboard switches which are only on or off. It aims to bring the advantage of an analog stick, such as on a controller, to the keyboard. This is a very noble mission because, as we all know, the keyboard is a tool of the gods, but the controller... This input device is unacceptable! Having grown up on an XT-class IBM portable PC from the early 80s, I've been part of the glorious PC master race since the age of 4, so the keyboard and mouse are almost natural extensions of my body, whereas a controller feels awkward and limited to me. I mean, there's so few buttons and you can use so few of them at a time. But when it came down to a comparison, controller proponents always had one argument to which keyboard users had no answer. Modern controllers have analog capabilities, whereas keyboards are limited to digital only. Well, no longer. The advantage of an analog input is that you can perform more precisely tailored actions in some games. This is by no means useful in every game, but for example when you want to walk slowly instead of just running at full speed, or especially if you want to play a driving game without being limited to 45-degree steering angles, analog input can be of great help. As a result, some types of games lend themselves much more naturally to controllers than to keyboards. Driving games in particular are a common example of this, which is why driving games are much more commonly found on consoles than on PC. Although driving games, even some pretty good ones, do exist on PC, the limitation to digital input does often necessitate some control adjustments in that setting. In many games, such as Need for Speed Most Wanted, which is what I'm playing now, they implement huge input delays to prevent the player from massively oversteering and making super sharp turns at every key press. In these games, analog, air quotes, is achieved by holding the keys down longer rather than further down, but as a result all input feels like it's really delayed. Truly analog input would have no need for such a delay, so it should be much more responsive. To achieve the analog function on a keyboard, Wooting adopted a modified version of the Flaretech switch produced by Adomax. This is an optical switch which is capable of reflecting a varying amount of light based on how far you press the key. I did a teardown video a few weeks ago in which I discussed the mechanism in detail. If you're interested in the precise workings, click the link in the description to take you to that video. Now before we dive into the analog performance of the keyboard, let's first look at the basics. The Wooting One is marketed as a gaming keyboard, hence why they opted for a 10 keyless form factor, although they're also working on a full-size version called the 2. They gave me a linear version, but you can also deck them out with clickies. The build quality seems okay. It does have a floating switch design, which tends to make switches a bit more vulnerable, and I can't seem to find a way to open it, which always annoys the piss out of me. But despite weighing only 755 grams, the chassis seems reasonably tough, although there is a little bit of flex in it. It also has an aluminium top plate and a pan made out of ABS. It's got a thin but braided detachable cable and a nice 3-way cable gutter. Seriously, why don't other keyboards do this anymore? It's really useful and not even expensive to implement. The keycaps are laser-ablated ABS, which is pretty standard nowadays. It's not as durable as double-shot molding, which lasts much longer, and fingerprints stand out on them pretty badly, but at least it's got a perfectly normal font on the keycaps, which looks nice and elegant, nothing at all like most gamer keyboards, thankfully. It comes with a nowadays somehow obligatory full RGB backlighting with 16 million colors, and it's fully programmable with all kinds of patterns as well, and blah 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 RGB blah 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 blah. Now on to more important matters, the switches themselves. The Flaretech switch is an optoelectric switch. and this thankfully gives it many advantages. First of all, it's incredibly reliable, as the sensing mechanism is contactless and it just relies on an LED and a photoresistor. It's been tested for 100 million key presses per key, although I'm sure it's in actuality a lot higher. I estimate it could probably get into the billions. But because even just 100 million key presses takes about a year to test, most manufacturers just cut off their testing after 100 million and slap that figure on instead. Of course, the thing that should give out first is the infrared LED that provides the signal, in which case the lifetime of the keyboard is better expressed in hours, not key presses. They even increased the lifetime of the LEDs sixfold by only switching them on when that particular row is being scanned, a clever little trick, resulting in an estimated lifetime of about 300,000 hours, or roughly 34 years of non-stop use, so it's very high on the durability front. One common concern that a lot of viewers expressed in my teardown video was how reliable the switches were in the face of contamination, with dust for example, and how well they could stand up to that. I inquired about this, and apparently they've minimized these influences over several iterations by increasing the play in the slider a bit. Even if it turns out your switches somehow get dirty though, the switches are clip-in and can be removed very easily without desoldering. There aren't any electronics or metal parts apart from the spring in there either, so you could clean them very easily if necessary. Another advantage of these optical switches is an exceptionally fast response time due to the virtually bounce-free nature of the sensing mechanism, as well as several quite complicated optimizations Wooting have done keyboard side to make it respond as quickly as it possibly could. The keyboard uses a 1000 Hz polling rate, which is the fastest that's achievable over USB, but the keyboard's own firmware records key presses much faster than that at less than 1 millisecond. According to measurements done by one user, the total delay between physical input and the signal getting to the PC is less than 2.5 milliseconds, which is seriously quick for those of you who care about that. Instead of a matrix, the keyboard uses multiplexers to scan for key presses too, which apparently give it N-key rollover. And even the limitations of the USB interface don't seem to stop this. I tested it with both my hands down, and I couldn't see a single press being missed. A bit overkill, I know, but still. And finally, another advantage of contactless sensing is that you get less friction in the key travel, which results in a very smooth key feel. Which segues us nicely into the feels department. What does it feel like to use? Well, these linear ones, called red switches, despite not actually being red, are light linear switches with weighting similar to Cherry MX Red, which I actually kind of like, but the thing that struck me most is how Jesus Christ monkey balls smooth these are. Holy shit! Man, I've tried some smooth switches in my time, but these take the cake. It's almost completely frictionless. They appear to be slightly smoother even than Bloody's already ridiculously silky LK1 optical switches as well. One of the smoothest switches I know are Fujitsu leaf spring switches, which are an extremely clever design, and although it's perhaps not 100% fair to compare such an old, used keyboard from 1987 to a brand new one, this one is really clean, and I'd say the Flaretechs have noticeably less friction. They are without a doubt the smoothest switch I've ever used. They are a bit on the light side, somewhat easy to actuate with just the weight of your fingers, and I make a fair amount of typing mistakes on this keyboard, but there's a solution for that as well that I'll get back to in a bit. So in terms of key feel, it's bang on. I mean, it's really good. This would have made it into my top 5 for sure if I'd had it at the time. But now, let's go and take a look at the analog aspect. Some details on the analog system. The working range is from 1.5 to 3.6 millimeters, roughly half the key travel. Before 1.5 millimeters, no signal is recorded, and everything after 3.6 millimeters is over travel. You can toggle between digital and analog with this mode button for if you require strictly digital output, and thankfully it's not a hotkey but a dedicated key, which helps a lot, especially when testing it. Interestingly, you can customize the response factor in the keyboard software called the Wootility. By default it's set to linear, but you can use several other options as well as define your own, and you can even set 3 different profiles. The option to set any response you want is actually really powerful. You shouldn't overlook the importance of it. Already users have set up special profiles specifically tailored to optimize performance in specific games, which you can download. The Wootility is also used to customize the backlighting, and you can even give each analog profile its own color scheme to help you recognize it more easily. Now, I've tested lots of keyboard configuration utilities such as Corsairs, Logitech's, Ajazz's, and a few others, and my conclusion is that they all suck fucking big fucking elephant dicks. God knows what testicle pig fucker designed them. This one, though, amazingly enough, is actually really good and usable. It brings up simple tutorials with funny accents that have you up and running in minutes, and because the keyboard is natively recognized as a keyboard, gamepad, and Xbox controller, there's minimal driver bullshit. I didn't have to touch a single one during my use of this keyboard. One might even go as far as to speculate that the software was designed by an actual human being, which would definitely be a first for one of these utility packages. Some features can be customized keyboard side, but for the more in-depth things, you'll need the Wootility. This little box here, which you might just overlook if you're not careful, is an excellent feature of its own. It allows you to set the actuation depth anywhere in the analog range while working in digital mode. So if you find that you actuate the switches too easily with the weight of your fingers, like me, just move the point downward a bit and it should stop. Or inversely, if you want a really high actuation point for faster response, you can move it up to 1.5 millimeters. Seriously, this alone is actually a fantastic feature. Now, the way the analog signal works is that it is also a gamepad and Xbox controller, sending out either X input or direct input signals. No, it doesn't emulate a controller, it is a controller, just in the shape of a keyboard, but it is also a keyboard, and apparently it can also be a mouse. This navigates around a bunch of compatibility and driver issues, but I'll leave that because otherwise we'll never get to the actual usage. So what you can do in the Wootility is to define certain keys as controller demands, and the Wooting outputs those controller commands in-game when you're in analog mode. So for example, you can bind the WASD cluster to the left analog stick, forward, left, down, or right. In fact, I think it's bound to that by default, and left shift to left trigger, and right shift to right trigger, etc, etc. So basically you set up controller buttons on the keyboard. Then you go into a game, and as you can see, for example here, the further you press down a key, the more you accelerate or the more you turn, etc. It works. Another way you can use the analog system is by binding a double keystroke macro to different levels of key press, called the DKS system. This is still in an early stage, and you sometimes need to press keys really hard in the menu before it recognizes them for some reason, but I've been told this is particularly useful in MOBA games like League of Legends, which I don't play, but as they demonstrate here, for example, you can see the casting range of a spell with E, and then bind bottoming out to Shift E, which actually casts the spell, so you can both scout and cast with a single button, which seems extremely useful. I experimented with doing something similar in Unreal Tournament, where you can directionally dash or dodge in one direction by double pressing WAS or D. So I set up a few DKS macros where pressing it a little bit presses the key once and pressing it fully presses it twice. And although I checked it and it does actually output these characters, I can't get it to work properly in game. Interestingly, when I bind AA to my Focus macro pad from the 90s, it does actually work, it dashes just fine. This also seems a great application of their clicky switches, which at first I wasn't sure would make a lot of sense on an analog keyboard, but when you think about it, you can use the tactile bump of the clicky switch to divide the key press into a part where it's slightly pressed and a part where it's fully pressed, a bit like on the instant profile in the Wootility. So if you don't want to accidentally cast that spell I talked about earlier, you can sit above the tactile bump to scout and press it down to cast it. In other words, if you want a trinary switch, the clicky switches seem like a perfect fit. And you can swap any amount of them in at will as well, because the switches are clip-in and don't require desoldering. So you can just pull out a switch like this, plop in a new one, and bam! Now, I was thinking of what games I wanted to use this keyboard with to demonstrate the analog features, but ironically it's during the center showpiece that the problems start propping up. Technically speaking, because the keyboard is a gamepad and an Xbox controller, any game that is compatible with either of these will be natively compatible with the Wooting. But in practice, and this is evidenced by how hard it was to make this video, actually finding a game that works perfectly with it is harder than it might seem. One of the games that works very well is Overwatch. Seriously, do people even still play this game? Which is out of the box almost perfectly compatible with it, but for which analog input isn't super useful because almost everything in that game basically happens at full speed anyway. So basically in Overwatch the integration is seamless, but its usefulness is limited. Another one is Rocket League, which I also used to play a lot, but I haven't for a while as I kind of overplayed it. I revisited that game as well and found it's actually pretty useful in this regard, as it allows you to steer much nicer and more accurately. I found the slow profile particularly nice for this game, as it gives a lot of room to ease off on the steering. Then there's GTA 5, which I bought on a discount to test this out. It took about 45 minutes of not being able to do what I want, having to follow some stupid mandatory tutorial. I mean, seriously guys, remember when this was all the tutorial you needed in a GTA game?
And remember, respect is everything.
And then you could just do whatever the hell you bloody well liked? Anyway, when I was finally allowed to play the game, I found that yes, it works quite well with this too. Because there's a lot of 90-degree intersections, there's a bit more acute steering in this, but still, it works.
You gotta watch out, fool!
I found that if you really purposely try to analog it out, so to speak, it doesn't work all that great. But if you pretend it's not there, your mind will subconsciously press the keys less or more, and it comes much more natural that way. Apparently you can use it with CSGO as well, but I hate that game so much there's no way I'm going to touch or even install that bullshit again. Fuck that. It's also said that it's good with any racing game, but I've had limited success with that. In Need for Speed Most Wanted, for example, the steering is still made for PCs, and the huge steering delay they put in kind of fucks up the analog controls. Thankfully, it does work really well with Blur, which is an underrated little gem of a racer I can definitely recommend. It's super enjoyable and the analog control really works fantastically. In Far Cry 3 you have to choose between keyboard and mouse or gamepad, so while you have analog keyboard controls you lose mouse look, so it doesn't work really. And in Far Cry 4 for some reason I simply couldn't get it to recognize controller commands at all, even though it says it detected a gamepad when I hotplug it, which usually fixes any issues I found. Most of all, the game I had wanted to play with it is Rainbow Six Siege, in which being able to peek pixel by pixel or sneak by just pushing down the key less, rather than having to use a separate sneak toggle button, would have been really useful. Sadly, the game doesn't allow simultaneous input from multiple input devices, so if you use the analog keys it disables mouse input on the spot, so you stop shooting when you move, and when you're moving you can't shoot or get in or out of ADS. It's really a shame, and ironically it's not even the keyboard's fault, it's just that the game is coded not to allow it to function. And that's really the biggest limitation here, it simply doesn't work with every game, or at least not yet. All the games probably won't support X input at all, and ones that do might have some crazy limitations like Siege does. It is compatible with many games, including some really popular ones right now, like Overwatch, Rocket League, PUBG, LOL, CSGO, etc. And Wooting are trying to make game companies make their games as compatible as possible with analog keyboards, but unfortunately this issue is kind of out of their hands. Sometimes you also have to tinker a little bit to get a game to work, for example by fully disabling the digital keys on the analog profiles, or by moving the actuation point all the way to the bottom. If you don't, I found that on some games the digital keys take precedence and you won't notice anything analog happening at all. So to sum up the analog part, there are lots of games it works with, but how compatible and useful it is depends on each game individually, and I'm not sure there's a definitive list. I mean, I've seen one or two, but I'm not sure how accurate they are. For example, this one lists games which support simultaneous gamepad and mouse input, but that one actually includes Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, which, as we established earlier, is definitely not working as intended, so don't expect it to work miracles for every game out there. If you're unsure, you can always look up or ask what other people's experiences with that game are using the Wooting. For those who are wondering what the manufacturing tolerances with this keyboard are, they are extremely tight. Variations of any parts in fractions of a millimeter affect the signal, which goes so far as sliders coming from a different part of the 60 count injection mold performing differently, which is an issue you technically need to keep in mind when you hot swap switches, as the keyboards are assembled with specific switches in specific places for optimal results. And let's be honest, the fact that they're hot swappable at all in such a sensitive assembly is a minor miracle on its own. Wooting have optimized the assembly in such a way that the parts that perform the best and get the strictest tolerance checks are applied to the cluster of keys that are used by gamers, with looser tolerances for example, the print screen key. Wooting have mentioned to me that getting consistency 100% right is one of the key challenges they're working on, but to be honest, the 4mm travel and 2mm analog range are so small that I honestly couldn't detect any noticeable inconsistency at all during testing, so I'm genuinely wondering if these inconsistencies are actually noticeable by a human in the field, or if this is really only apparent when you analyze them using a machine, and I suspect it's the latter. Summing it all up, it works. And it can be really handy, but at least at the moment, basically every game responds to it differently. With some it works flawlessly, with others it doesn't work at all, and you might need one or two tricks to get it working nicely or usefully from time to time. So if you think you can just plug it in and it will instantly work with everything you throw at it, no, you'll be disappointed. Luckily, Wooting have FAQs, tutorials, videos, a knowledge base, and a Discord server, so there's plenty of help, but it will require some prep work to get it going and perhaps some tinkering to get it just where you want it. That said, analog compatibility issues with specific games aside, the keyboard itself is actually a really nice keyboard with ultra smooth, extremely durable, hot swappable linear switches, which lets you customize the actuation point and by 2-stroke commands to different levels of key press. Even if no games were compatible at all, that's already a lot of keyboard you're getting. It's for sale at the moment for €140 or about $150. I'll put a link in the description that shows you a list of resellers where you can buy it. It's not a cheap keyboard, but the high quality, extreme durability, and unique features means I'd say it's quite fairly priced actually. It's still noticeably cheaper than a Corsair K95 or Logitech G910 or most other top-of-the-line gamer keyboards, and I'd say you're getting a lot more for your money with this one. I really enjoyed my time using it, definitely recommended. That's it for this behemoth of a review. I hope you enjoyed it because this one took much longer to make than any video to date. Regardless, if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.